Hello, and welcome everybody to the National Trends in Disability Employment,
or nTIDE,
Lunch and Learn series.
Just a few housekeeping items before we begin.
This webinar is being recorded.
We will post an archive of each webinar each month on our website at www.researchondisability.org/nTIDE.
This site will also provide copies of the presentations, the speakers' bios, full transcripts, and other valuable resources.
As an attendee of this webinar, you are a viewer.
To ask questions of the speakers, click on the Q&A box on your webinar screen and type your questions into the box.
Speakers will review these questions and provide answers during the last section of the webinar.
Some questions may be answered directly in the Q&A box.
If you have any questions following this recording, please contact us at disability.statistics@unh.edu
or toll free at 866-538-9521 for more information.
Thanks for joining us.
Enjoy today's webinar.
Hi everybody, this is Andrew Haltonville. Welcome to today's webinar. As the two speakers just said, let us know if you have any thoughts about our new introduction. We can always make changes for season 3. So again, welcome to nTIDE. Let's just jump into the numbers, and then I'll turn it over to Denise for our speakers. All right, so as was introduced earlier, nTIDE is the National Trends in Disability Employment Lunch and Learn, which occurs noon Eastern every first Friday. This month was one of the times that the BLS actually has to wait a Friday, so we're actually doing it on the second Friday. It's a joint effort of the Kessler Foundation, UNH, Institute on Disability, and the Association of University Centers. So this is also partly funded by NIDLR, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. So let's skip over this part. We're going to probably just start jumping into the numbers now that people have had a chance to. I've heard my audio is dropping. How about I get close? Well, I don't want to get closer than my video. I'll speak louder. So Denise will follow me with nTIDE News, and then we have Nadia and Bobby Silverstein to talk about their work, and then we'll do Q&A. So John, are you there?
I'm here, Andrew. So next slide. I'm just going to give the background and some information on the nTIDE report. As Andrew had mentioned, it's a monthly report and press release with infographic that looks at the latest employment statistics. It uses information from the jobs report, which is released by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, usually on the first Friday of each month. Because February was such a short month, BLS couldn't get the numbers crunched by the 2nd, so they moved it to the 9th this month. And it's basically a joint effort between the Kessler Foundation and UNH. We actually marked our 5th year of doing the nTIDE this month. Next slide, please.
It's like a long time.
It doesn't seem that long, but anyway. The source of the data is from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it uses the current population survey, which is the official source of the unemployment rate. And it's a survey of civilians or the data we use is from civilians age 16 to 64 who are not living in institutions. And this information has been available since for people with disabilities since September 2008 onward. That's when the Census Bureau added the 6 disability questions to national surveys. The data for people with disabilities is not yet seasonally adjusted, and which is why we compare to the same month last year. Next slide.
All right.
And I think you're going to give the numbers. Take it away.
All right. So this month we had another good month. This is our 23rd consecutive month of good news. We saw the employment to population ratio, so that's the percentage of people who are working, go from 28.1% to 30.5%. And again, this is compared to the same time last year, so that's a 2.4 percentage point increase, which is pretty big. About 8.5% increase if you do it percentage-wise, a percent of a percentage. People without disabilities didn't see much gains, a little bit of gains from the same time last year, from 22.8% to 73.5%. So an increase of about 1 percentage point, maybe 1% overall. And so this is similar to the story we've seen over the last, we've seen these kinds of gains pretty much for the last, I'd say for the last 2 years almost. Next month will be a 2-year run. So this is really an unprecedented run for us. We said we've been doing it for 5 years, and boy, for the first several years, it was pretty sad news. You know, we saw really the people with disabilities lagging well behind people without disabilities, people with disabilities lagging quite a bit behind. We also see the same kind of growth for the, same kind of increase for the labor force participation rate. So this is the percentage not only that are working, but are actively looking for work. And again, we see gains for people with disabilities and relatively marginal gains for people without disabilities. So we see an increase from 31.5 to 33.6. And that's great news. There's, of course, still a lot of room to improve. If we look at the employment to population ratio over time, again, as John mentioned, it goes back to September of 2008 when they first started publishing the official statistics for people with disabilities. And you see that long time when we were really seeing continued declines. You know, we started this right around the bottom time in 2013, in March of 2013. And that's right when we're kind of really bottoming out in terms of the trend for people with disabilities. And so again, this is the percentage that are working. Let's take a little bit of a closer look and snap a trend line onto this. And here you can see, let's clean it up a little bit. Oops, I didn't want to show that one just yet. So, you know, here you can see that the relatively good news over the last 2 years. We've really been hesitant on making a call about whether this is good news or just a temporary increase. But I think we're pretty solid on pretty solid ground saying that this is an increase, and it's consistent with a lot of the stories about the economy reaching full employment over the last few months. We've been really seeing a lot of discussion about full employment, and in part that may be due to the flattening out of the employment of people without disabilities, which is pretty representative of the overall employment. And so you see people with disabilities being called upon more and more as the economy reaches what is considered full employment. But it's hard to consider it full employment when the employment of people, when employment really hasn't reached its previous high. Remember, this is 2008 in September. This is actually before a lot of the job loss. So the downward trend that you see at the Great Recession, it was quite a bit higher before that. And so, these numbers are really indicative of really not reaching back to the full level that we were before, even though unemployment is low and they're calling it full employment. One thing I wanted to do for folks is just to kind of give a sense of where the gap is. If we just did the distance And again, this distance is a little bit different. It's a little bit higher because these are charted. These two lines are charted on different axes, but this gives you a sense of how the gap is returning to its prior level. And of course, there's still quite a large gap. So with that said, I'm going to just turn it back over to Denise, or turn it over to Denise, and she can start up with the latest news, and then we'll hear from Nadia and Bob.
Terrific. Thanks, Andrew. Why don't you put up the first slide? We're going to do some federal policy work today, as we usually do, and I want to make sure I update you on things that have happened since we talked in February, and as always, there's a lot. And then a few pieces of news, studies, and things that have come out that I found of interest that I hope you do as well. Let's start first by just saying that there is a mistake on this slide, and I clearly put it together before I went on vacation. And clearly I was already thinking about my vacation. So in the very first line, or the second line, where it says the continuing resolution expires February 23rd, that's March 23rd. So let's talk about budget and appropriations. The continuing resolution that currently exists expires I just said it again, March 23rd. The CR that passed that led up to this date included a whole bunch of other things. We used to call that the Christmas tree effect, and they did that on this particular CR that passed early in February. And so I want you to know that there were a number of things included in that, in addition to the continuing resolution. There was an additional, there's now a 10-year extension of the CHIP program, meaning they added 4 additional years under that CR. The community health center extension, the home visiting program was extended. It did not include money follows the person, and I'll mention that in just a second, but it did include lifting the sequester caps and the debt ceiling and increasing the budget caps. So all of those things that we thought were going to be problematic and were going to take, that the Congress was going to have to look at in the next several months, the debt ceiling, lifting the debt ceiling, the sequester caps that were going to come into play, the budget caps, all of those were taken care of in this continuing resolution. It closed the donut hole in Medicare on the prescription drug plan and included the disaster relief for Puerto Rico and the territories. All of this, and we've gotten this question a lot, so I want to be really clear, while the continuing resolution expires on March 23rd and Congress has to do something about that, the rest of this stuff actually goes forward. It was passed and it is a done deal. So the CHIP extension does not expire on March 23rd. The home visiting program is extended and continues. All of those things are now law. So that's the next step. What you need to be watching for next is something we assume an omnibus, but we're getting through March now and haven't seen that yet. But we're expecting an omnibus for all of the appropriations. Now bear in mind, this is what we're talking about for FY17. So it started in October 2017 and goes through the end of September 2018. So that's where we are. As we've discussed in the past, most of the things under the continuing resolution and most of even the omnibus numbers that we're looking at are pretty flat funded, with the exception of the supported employment program, not supported employment under Medicaid, not anything, but the supported employment program under VR is zeroed out. There are some other things like that, but in general, it's pretty flat funding. So that's, and we expect that that's what we're going to see for the rest of for the omnibus that's coming, which will fund us through the end of September. We can talk about that some more if you want to. The next one. Next slide, Andrew.
Trying, okay.
Now, let's talk about the next budget proposal. So the president's budget proposal just got released in the beginning of February. It seems so long ago now, but it was only February 12th. It's only a month ago. And the president's budget, and I want to be clear about this one too, this is not a done deal. As a matter of fact, it probably is not going to go anywhere in the form that it's in, but it is an indication of what the administration is thinking. And there were a number of things that showed up in this. The there's a reduction of non-defense discretionary funding and an increase in defense funding. There's $1.4 trillion in Medicaid cuts to SNAP, housing, student loans, TANF, reduces Department of Education by 10.5%. There's a whole host of things here. From an employment perspective, obviously the Medicaid cuts are important. Obviously the non-defense discretionary is important. Obviously the Department of Education is important. All of these are important. There is a maintaining of the career and technical education money, and there is an additional $200 million in the president's budget on apprenticeships. So why is any of this important if the president's budget is not likely to be what passes Congress in the long run? Again, it's the priorities for the administration. And therefore, from the perspective of the employment things that we're talking about, I think the career and technical education is interesting, and the increase in apprenticeships is interesting. I know there's some work going on within the disability world. Madeline Will is one of those who's been at the lead of that, but we're also having continuing conversations from the AUCD point of view with folks from the National Skills Coalition and others on apprenticeships and how we can make sure that people with disabilities and some of our folks get access to those apprenticeship programs, and how can we open those up so that they're more open to people with disabilities. So the fact that there is a big push on apprenticeships, I think, is an important piece to pay attention to. Next slide. Some other federal things. This is, and Bobby may mention, although that's not what Bobby's on here to talk about today, the ADA Education and Reform Act. This is an attempt to amend the ADA. It passed the House 225 to 192. And it is the first time that the ADA has been amended, or is the attempt to amend it, without disability community support. And so I want to be sure I call this to your attention as well. It eliminates the incentive for businesses and organizations to make their services accessible. It's what we used to call the ADA Notification Act, where it requires a person with a disability to provide a business with legal notice detailing how the architectural barriers that are in that business violate the ADA. And in particular, it imposes a 6-month waiting period to resolve that violation before anything can be done for the person with a disability. And if progress, quote, progress is made, that 6-month waiting period can be extended. Clearly, the ADA is a civil rights law. Clearly, what this does is limit civil rights in a way that other civil rights groups have simply not had to face. I want to raise it for you. There have been really strong opposition from the disability community and other civil rights groups. There's been really strong opposition to it from a number of members of the Senate. There's a letter that went around that's a Dear Colleague letter from Senator Hassan, Senator Case. There's a bunch of people on that letter saying this is wrong. This is something that we are not in favor of. But we continue to watch this and watch for it to come up in the Senate. So the advocate in me says to you, this is something that we need to pay a lot of attention to. This is something that we need to be calling our members of Congress, particularly your senators, to say, hey, this is not right. This is a civil rights law. We don't amend civil rights laws by saying that you have to wait 60 days in order to get your civil rights. That is just not who we are. And there is no reason that it should be that way for the disability community. This is one that the community feels very strongly about, and I think all of you out there would understand why, and I would really urge you to get involved. I also would say to you, don't just assume that if somebody's been with us on other pieces of legislation, they're going to automatically be with us on this one. There have been a number of Democrats who voted in favor of it in the House. There are some Democrats, I believe, who are still co-sponsors of it in the Senate. This one's important, folks. So really go out there and make your voices heard. Okay, next slide, Andrew. Now I want to move on. I did want to say one piece. I said I'd come back to this before I move on to this. The Money Follows the Person. For those of you who are involved in Money Follows the Person was not included in the continuing resolution that passed in February. We had thought maybe we'd crossed our fingers, we'd try to urge people to do that. It was not included. There is, however, a bill that is set to be introduced literally any minute. We thought it was going to be introduced on Monday. It wasn't. We thought it was going to be introduced on Tuesday. It wasn't. But it's coming. That is a reauthorization of money follows the person. So that's another one that keep your eye on it. I will raise it again in next month's call. It's important because clearly what it does is move people from institutional settings into the community. For all of you on this call, you understand why that's so important and the impact that that has on employment. So we'll raise it again. I'll let you know as soon as it's introduced, but it's another one of those places where you can talk to your states and to your members of Congress about it and say this is important and why. Okay, a couple of things I want you to know that are on the websites, various websites. EARN, an ODEP program, Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion. EARN has a new piece up on employer financial incentives. This is one, I tell you once in a while that I keep things in a little folder on my desk that I can always have as a resource. This is one of those that I have in my little folder on my desk because it goes through a variety of the financial incentive, or the variety of financial incentives for employers where they can gain assistance for employing people with disabilities. It talks about the employer tax incentives. It talks about veteran-specific tax incentives, and it gives you references to them. So this is one of those that for use in employing people with disabilities, for your own use in talking to folks with disabilities, there are some really good incentives out there. And this is just a shortcut, couple pages and with links to tell you more. So again, it's on my desk and I urge it to be on yours. Next slide, Andrew. Pete also has some things out now. They did a series of podcasts on the future of work back in December and January, and these podcasts are now online. The links are in the slides. It's about how people with disabilities fit into the gig economy and new technology. They're really good. And actually Bobby Silverstein, who is one of our speakers in a couple of minutes, did one of them. I urge you to listen and look for these. It's some of the really good work that Pete is doing. And it's another one where they were developed in partnership with Workology. Assistive technology and accessible technology is really important in the work we do. And Pete continues to do a really good job on this stuff. Okay, next slide. Sometimes I raise things with you that are international. And this month I saw two studies that were really interesting that I thought you might be interested in. So this is a quote from one of them: disability and poverty are believed to operate in a cycle with each reinforcing the other. While agreement on the existence of a link is strong, robust empirical evidence substantiating and describing this potential association is lacking. So again, some of what these studies show are things that many of us on the phone would kind of say, well, duh. But having said that, now you have some places to go look. So next slide, let's talk about the first one. The first one is in Disability and Health Journal in December 2017, The Reality of Disability, Multidimensional Poverty of People with Disability and Their Families in Latin America. So this one looked at census data from Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Mexico. What they found, not surprisingly, is that people with disabilities in those countries and their families had higher incidence, intensity, and levels of multidimensional poverty compared to people living in other households. Again, it's one of those that probably most of us on this phone would say, well, that is what we would expect to find, but it is something that we didn't have data on before. And clearly the conclusion of the article and the writers is that those social policies in those countries should aim to reduce those levels of poverty and deprivation. And that gives us all an entree into how to do that. Because we know, well, we hope we know how to do that. We at least know some of the ways to do that. So that's the first one I found. Second one, slide, Andrew, is on a systematic review, poverty and disability in low and middle income countries. This one, again, looked at China, India, and Brazil. And the studies, 150 studies, well, it looked at other countries as well. Let me rephrase that. Half those studies were in China, India, and Brazil. So what it found, 81% of the studies found evidence of a positive association between disability and a poverty marker. That persisted. Oops, I'm sorry, go back one slide, Andrew. That persisted whether the results were when the results were disaggregated. So when they looked, was it gender, was it poverty, was it the measure of poverty, was it impairment level? The relationship still persisted, and I think that's an important one. Okay, now next slide, Andrew. By country and income group, the proportion also changed, but you can see there what the proportions were they found with low-income countries, 59%, with upper middle income countries, the relationship 72%. By age group, it was different. The proportion of studies reporting a positive association was lowest in older adults and highest for working age adults. That also, I think, is a really important one for those of us who are involved in employment in the disability world. This clearly leads to the need to find policy to break those cycles and for further research. But this also gives you access to, because they did the systematic review of other studies that had been done, this also gives you access to a variety of those other studies that they reviewed. And I think for anyone looking at disability and poverty internationally, or for those of us who are looking at disability and policy and poverty here, any of those, I think, could play a part. Next slide, Andrew. I think that's the end of my stuff, right? Yeah. Okay. So I am thrilled today to introduce the nTIDE guest speakers for today. And they're going to do some introducing of themselves, and I'm going to turn it over to them to go ahead and move through their slides and things. But I just want to say at the outset, Nadia Ibrahim is the Senior Policy Advisor and the federal lead on the SEED program, State Exchange on Employment and Disability, at ODEP. She spent 15 years in the government at DOD, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Labor. And I have to say, I got really excited when Nadia and I and some of her team met several months ago to talk about what's going on in SEED. As some of you may know, I spent 15 years doing state government relations prior to coming to AUCD. So any work that's going out in the States is always of huge interest to me. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done there that as a catalyst for new and exciting ideas. And so the work that they're doing, I find really exciting. And then secondly, Bobby Silverstein, who is a principal at Powers, Piles, Sutter, and Verval. I'm going to let Bobby introduce himself, but just suffice it to say that Bobby and I have known each other way too long, dating all the way back to my beginning in the disability field, which was working on the Americans with Disabilities Act, not Bobby's beginning in the field. He'd been in it longer than I had. But many people say that they wrote the ADA or they helped write the ADA. Bobby's one of those who really did, and continues to do really cutting edge work on disability and all kinds of issues, both related to ADA and a whole bunch of other things. And I'll let him say more, but he's also working on the SEED project. So I am really thrilled to introduce, I'm going to start with Nadia, and I'm thrilled to have both of you here and looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Nadia.
Thank you so much, Denise. As Denise said, I am the federal lead on the ODEP's work in the states. And as you know, everything in the federal government needs an acronym, including our project, the State Exchange on Employment and Disability. Next slide, please. Next slide. Just to give you a sense of where we're going, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of ODEP, talk about the SEED initiative and one of our major outputs so far, which is Work Matters. And then Bobby will cover some policy options in Work Matters and give some examples. I'll talk about resources that we have available and your opportunity to share your own ideas. Next slide, please. As many of you probably know, ODEP is a cabinet-level agency led by our Assistant Secretary, and it was established in 2001. We have a mission of developing and influencing policy related to the employment of people with disabilities, really aimed at increasing the number and the quality of employment opportunities for people with disabilities. We do that mainly through our policy teams, as well as our research and evaluation team, and our communications and outreach team. We have 4 policy teams. The youth team, which focuses on youth. Employer team, which focuses on employers and runs the EARN Technical Assistance Center. The workforce system team, which focuses on the workforce development system, and the employment-related supports team, which addresses all the supports that someone needs to maintain and find employment. And that's where the SEED project falls under. Next slide, please. The goal with SEED is really to foster a dialogue with state intermediary organizations and state policymakers. Our goal is to really build the capacity of intermediary organizations like the Council of State Governments, the National Conference of State Legislatures, National Governors Association, and Women in Government to address policy related to the employment of people with disabilities. Next slide, please. This particular year, we have 4 main priority themes related to stay at work, return to work, retaining and reemploying workers who have been injured or ill or displaced in some other way, readying a skilled workforce, and that's where we would focus on things related to apprenticeship. That is certainly an area of focus for us this year. And then harnessing innovation, things like assistive technology, autonomous vehicles, and then empowering veterans with disabilities is the 4th priority area that we have this year. Next slide, please. SEED really provides many different resources. Mainly, we provide technical assistance to states directly, and also work with our intermediary organizations to produce policy documents and any other webinars and such that might be helpful. We use a variety of tools, crowdsourcing platforms, and I'll touch upon that later, to get feedback from various communities, including the disability community. And many of our resources highlight best practices and state examples designed to assist in the development and dissemination of inclusive policies. Next slide, please. SEED really seeks to serve as a resource to both states, state policymakers, and the intermediate organizations themselves. We seek to provide customized language to potential legislation, connect individuals and groups with our federal agencies, the national community, and advocacy and business organizations as well. We also provide meaningful data on disability employment and related issues. Next slide, please. One of our major outcomes thus far has been a national task force done in collaboration with the National Conference of State Legislators and the Council of State Governments. We refer to that as the National Task Force on Workforce Development for people with disabilities. The membership included 60 policymakers, select advisors from ODEP and the Disability Committee, as well as members of CSG and NCSL. The goal was to really develop a framework and identify key issues impacting the employment of people with disabilities, and provide a framework of recommendations for states to then customize and really take those issues and move forward. The result was the Work Matters report, which Bobby will touch upon shortly. But again, it really serves as the framework for our work and the foundation for the work of SEED. And really, we hope that states will take it and move forward with the information. Next slide, please. This is just where you can find the actual full report on CSG's website. They have a microsite devoted to Work Matters, and that microsite includes not only the report, but links to, it includes a clickable map that has links to legislation and activity in states around the country and the work being done in the states, as well as links to webinars that CSG has done and other resources that may be helpful. Next slide, please. Work Matters is really divided into 5 sort of themes, laying the groundwork. That section just discusses some of the foundational principles that we sort of laid as we as the National Task Force began its work. The idea that people with disabilities have a right to access work and have skills and talents to contribute to the workforce. Preparing for Work, which talks about youth with disabilities, apprenticeships, and getting the training that someone needs to access work and education. Getting to and accessing work opportunities, things like accessible transportation, technology, those supports necessary for someone to actually access potential job opportunities or to remain in the workforce. Staying at work, those policies that may impact someone's ability to either stay at work or return to work after injury or illness. And then self-employment and entrepreneurship was the 5th sort of theme that emerged. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Bobby, who will talk more about Work Matters and the policy options available in that document. Bobby?
Thanks, Nadia. Hi, this is Bobby Silverstein. Just 30-second bio. I was the former staff director and chief counsel to the Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy when we worked on the ADA, reauthorizations of the Rehab Act, reauthorizations of the Individuals with Disability Education Act, the DD Act, Tech Act, totally 20 bills enacted into law. After I left, I directed a disability policy center, and for the last 10 years, I have been principal at the law firm of Powers, Pyle, Sutter, and Verville, where I spend most of my time continuing to work on disability public policy issues and primarily identifying best promising and emerging practices. I am fortunate to be part of the SEED team and helped craft the Work Matters report that we're going to be discussing. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The report itself includes 13 broad categories of recommendations. I'm going to just, in this brief time, touch on 5 or 6 of them. But before I do, to me, the most important point I can make for those listening is that this Work Matters report and the website that Nadia made reference to is an incredible resource. Imagine having at your fingertips the ability to identify various state policies and in a very range of issues ranging from state as a model employer to private sector involvement to interagency coordination, work-based learning experiences, job retention, supporting disability-owned businesses. You have an interest in any of these issues, you click on the website, and under a topic, you will find examples, 5, 10 examples of states that are doing cutting-edge policies. You click on it, and right there, you have the legislation or regulations. For wonks, for policymakers, for advocates, this is a gold mine, and I hope you all use it. So let me go into some of the examples of what states are doing, and again, in each case, you go to the website that Nadia made reference to on Council of State Governments, you click on the state under a particular example, and up comes the actual legislation. Next slide. So let's start with state as a model employer. A number of states have developed formal mechanisms to try to enhance employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Maryland has a cabinet level position. A number of states have developed workforces, interagency working groups or task forces specifically looking at employment of people with disabilities. Kentucky right now is completing its own state Workforce Matters review. Oregon is doing a comprehensive review. A number of states have developed what we'll call affirmative action programs comparable to Section 501 of the Rehab Act that deals with federal agencies. They have said, we need to look at the data. Using the old maxim, what gets measured gets done. So they have hiring goals. They have strategic plans that are done that review how state agencies are doing things. They have reporting mechanisms so that there are reports that are given to the governor and others and made public, so that there really is a strategic effort to enhance employment among state agencies. Number of states have done fast-track hiring systems. Some of you may be familiar with Schedule A, Exempted Service Hiring Authority at the federal level. Well, a number of states have developed similar provisions that allow you to modify the typical service, civil service exam system and get to try to work through trial work periods, internships, and provide this opportunity to test. And because we know that there are prejudices, there are stereotypes about people with disabilities. Internships, trial work break these down. But if the civil service gets in the way in terms of the rules, people with disabilities will not have their opportunity. This provides their opportunity. Some states have actually developed mandatory interview requirements for people with disabilities. Another thing that we know works is centralized accommodation funds, where you don't have to work, a supervisor or of a particular department doesn't worry about hiring the most qualified person who might have a disability needing accommodations. They don't worry about the cost because somebody else is taking care of the cost. They just hire the best and the brightest. And a number of states have developed stay-at-work, return-to-work programs for their own employees. Next slide, please. Another thing that states are doing is focusing on how can they enhance employment opportunities by working with the private sector, by private sector businesses. Well, again, a number of states, like Section 503 of the Rehab Act, which deals with affirmative action by contractors with the federal government, a number of states have included people with disabilities among the groups. Number of states have said to businesses, you are looking for a single point of contact to help you figure out where the pipeline for people with disabilities is, but we also need help in understanding what our responsibilities are. A number of states have developed these single point of contact for pipelines, but they've also helped by providing technical assistance in ADA compliance and other federal laws. Number of states, as Denise mentioned, have developed tax incentive provisions, both tax credits for hiring people with disabilities and tax credits for barrier removal and providing supports. VR agencies around the country are stepping up to the plate and trying to develop that relationship with business and working with the American Job Centers so that there's a single place where businesses go to get assistance and information about hiring qualified people with disabilities. The next slide, please. We also looked at state policies dealing with interagency coordination and collaboration. We looked at some of the employment first policies that have developed over time and how people are implementing Section 511 of the Rehab Act, which facilitates competitive integrated employment as the default placement. Senator Harkin refers to this as the kick in the butt provision, which is to try to get people to try again, and try again to attempt competitive integrated employment. There are a number of MOUs that have developed between VR and Medicaid agencies, VR and mental health agencies, VR and intellectual disabilities agencies. Next slide, please. It is very exciting to note that a number of states are developing serious work-based learning experiences. They're developing guides and toolkits to work with school systems to make sure that the IEPs include work-based learning experiences and that people with disabilities are not excluded, that they are included as part of the career development efforts that apply to non-disabled folks. We have, as you all know, the VR, the Rehabilitation Act, Title I now requires 15% set aside for pre-employment transition services, and we identify a number of the state policies that facilitate that. And we have, as Nadia said, the Federal Apprenticeship Initiative. Next slide, please. Number of states are recognizing that they need to work with businesses. We have issues of workers' compensation, short-term, long-term disability. How do we keep people with disabilities connected to the workforce if they become ill or injured in terms of return to work? How do we keep them attached in terms of stay at work? These are very important initiatives, and we have described in the report how a number of states are adopting cutting-edge policies. In addition to the WIPA program, benefit counseling at the federal level, a number of states have actually provided resources under the state general fund to ensure that there are sufficient benefit counselors around the country, particularly with youth, so that they understand the incentive so that they can look at work as the natural approach rather than benefits. And we have identified a number of the state policies with respect to ABLE Act. Another issue that's not listed here is 4 or 5 states recently have adopted legislation for inclusive higher education. So that, and Denise is very familiar with this program, where they are really trying to get their universities to be in a position so that they can compete for the programs at the federal level. Next slide, please. Supporting disability-owned businesses. Again, there historically have been certain goals that are established in bid preferences for women and minorities. A number of states have expanded these to include people with disabilities. Some use VR for certification. Others use, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, use the USBLN, United States Business Leadership Network certification criteria. In addition, a number of states have provided incentives, grants, loans, as well as technical assistance and mentoring for disability-owned businesses to facilitate self-employment and entrepreneurship. And that's just, again, a quick overview of some of the topic areas that states are doing. It is an incredible opportunity for you to just steal instead of starting from scratch if you're interested in pursuing policy. I'm going to turn it back over to Nadia.
Thanks, Bobby. Next slide, please. Next slide. Just wanted to highlight NCSL's disability employment webpage that includes, again, a copy of the report, as well as some other NCSL specific resources developed, which includes a 101 webinar and a legislative scan, as well as a searchable database that includes more recent legislation related to disability employment in the broadest sense of the word. Next slide, please. I made reference to this earlier. CSG's National Task Force and Disability Employment microsite, which includes a copy of Work Matters report, as well as some other resources. Next slide, please. Next slide. We also have an opportunity right now going on through our ePolicyworks, the online tool for the disability community and others to provide input. The dialogue, the online dialogue that we have going on right now goes through the 16th and allows individuals to provide their thoughts related to readying a skilled workforce. So things like apprenticeships, family engagement, workforce preparation. We would just invite you through the URL listed on this slide to provide your thoughts and your input on what states could do or what they are doing that could be replicated by others. And that will be up through the end of this week, but there's also opportunity to provide input on previous dialogues that we've had around work matters. Next slide, please. And for those of you who may have additional questions or would like additional information on how you can partner with SEED as we work with our state intermediaries and state policymakers, please feel free to contact Bobby or I at the contact information listed on this slide. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Denise.
Actually, I think it's going back to Andrew, right, Andrew?
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, so you can ask questions. There are a couple ways to ask questions. One is through the Q&A button that's part of your Zoom meeting button bar, I guess. You can also contact the authors or the presenters directly, and their information is provided. Someone did ask a question about whether the slide presentations and all the materials are made available, and the answer is yes, they're made available through our website for nTIDE at researchondisability.org. And again, you can reach reach us through this website, Research on Disability. You can also call us toll-free or email us. We also have a Twitter hashtag, which can be, questions can be asked that way. So,
Andrew, since I don't see any questions
Sure.
up there, can I ask one? This is Denise. I already said that I'm the state policy geek on some levels. So I guess I would ask Bobby or Nadia, either one of you guys. So if I'm on the call and I'm somebody in a state out there and I want to get involved in trying to do something, what are the first couple of things I should do besides go to the website? What are the first couple of things I should do?
As an advocate, I would encourage you to check out the online dialogue going on right now, and certainly provide your thoughts and your input through that forum. You're also welcome to contact Bobby or I, and we'd connect you with potential individuals in your state who may be able to provide more information on how you can get involved.
So you have some state-specific people. Great. Bobby, any thoughts?
No, I think Nadia hit it right on. The only other thing I'd add, and Denise, you'll get a smile about this, is the notion of the disability community and the word community. Don't try to do something yourself. Work with others in the disability community in your state. That's the way progress is made, when we all work together.
I am smiling. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of work that can be done out there, folks, and just looking at the materials and even just taking them in, I'll answer an advocate piece of it. Just looking at some of the materials of other places that are doing this kind of work, just taking a piece of sample legislation in to meet with your member of your state legislature and say, hey, did you know that they're doing this in other states? Just that in and of itself shows that you're a resource and that they can come back to you and about any disability question, but it also starts sharing the legislation. So that's a really easy one. Thanks, Andrew. That was my plug.
we don't have any questions right away, but a lot of people are asking for the presentation. One question I have is there an effort at all to collect information on what major cities are doing? I know folks in New York and Chicago and LA, in particular, San Francisco, all have similar kinds of initiatives.
Yes, there is one of the ways that we're doing that is through the online dialogues, but we're also asking for those in the disability community or anyone really, if your state is doing something that is innovative or you think other states could benefit, we certainly invite you to share those examples. We would love to include them in updates to the Work Matters website, which happens on a regular basis. So please feel free to share those examples. That's how we can make Work Matters a living document, which we've always intended to do. We realize that things are always happening, so please share.
And just a quick additional point, if some of the examples in the text are effective as of a certain date, but we have developed and have a list of all state resources as of a week ago in terms of state legislation.
Sounds great. Sounds great. All right, so we're right at 1 o'clock, so we'll close. If we get any more questions, we'll be sure to forward them to Nadia and Bobby. I thank you both, Nadia, Bobby, and also Denise and John O'Neill for talking today. And that's a wrap for today. We don't have any closing music, so I'm not quite sure what to do now. So I will start humming goodbye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.